Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Salamis, 480 BC. The sea was not calm. It groaned, swelled, shivered. At dawn on that September day in 480 BC, the Saronic Gulf echoed not with the usual lullaby of lapping tides, but the creak of oars. Hundreds of war galleys, sleek, narrow and hungry, cut through the morning mist. Bronze rams at their bows glinted beneath the rising sun. Above, gulls circled like waiting harpies. And on the decks of those ships, Persian and Greek alike, men gripped their weapons, some whispering prayers, others muttering curses. The smell of salt, sweat, and fear was thick. They were about to fight for the soul of civilization. The Battle of Salamis did not happen by accident. It was not a random clash of navies in some forgotten corner of the ancient world. It was the thunderclap climax to a storm that had been building for years. For Persia, it was the culmination of a grand imperial dream, an empire stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, bound beneath the will of a single king. For the Greeks, it was a desperate act of defiance. A last stand, not on land like Thermopylae, but upon the churning sea, where wooden walls and raw courage would have to defy overwhelming odds. But before the oars bit into the gulf, before blood was spilled on the waves, we need to understand how the stage was set. The Persian Empire in 480 BC was a juggernaut, founded by Cyrus the Great, expanded by Darius, and now ruled by Xerxes, son of a god to his subjects. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen. Under Xerxes' reign, it was organized, efficient, and ruthless. An army counted not in thousands, but in hundreds of thousands. A navy built from every corner of the known world. Phoenician sailors, Egyptian marines, Cilician craftsmen, Ionian Greeks, many of whom now found themselves on the wrong side of history, fighting their Hellenic cousins. The king himself, Xerxes, was not a man to underestimate. He was tall, regal, and utterly convinced of his divine right to rule the world. To him, Greece was an annoyance, a fractious archipelago of squabbling city-states, proud and defiant, who had humiliated his father at Marathon. That humiliation demanded vengeance, and vengeance for Xerxes meant fire, steel, and submission. So he came, with a colossal host that crossed the Hellespont on pontoon bridges, an engineering feat so audacious it seemed to mock the gods themselves. He carved a canal through Mount Athos, bent earth and sea to his will, and marched into Greece like a god-king descending from Olympus. And for a time it worked. Cities burned, armies scattered, even mighty Athens was abandoned, her temples desecrated, her acropolis aflame. Xerxes entered the city as a conqueror, and from his throne upon a cliff at the edge of Salamis, he now prepared to watch the final act, the obliteration of the last Greek fleet. But Greek spirit had not yet drowned. It is easy to imagine the Greek commanders gathered in tense council on Salamis, their faces grim, eyes ringed with exhaustion and fury. Themistocles, clever, controversial, and sharp as a blade, stood at the heart of it. The architect of Athens' navy, a man who understood something that many of his peers did not. This war would not be won on land. It would be won with triremes. These were not great floating castles, no ironclads or fire-breathing behemoths. Greek triremes were agile, vicious predators. 3 rows of oars, a bronze ram affixed to the prow. Crewed by 170 men, mostly oarsmen, seated shoulder to shoulder, backs aching, calloused hands gripping smooth shafts of wood. Above them, hoplites and archers stood ready to board or defend. But the ship's true weapon was momentum. A well-timed strike could pierce an enemy's hull and split it like timber under an axe. Themistocles knew the Persian fleet outnumbered them, perhaps 3-1, but he also knew something else. The Persians were not a navy, not truly. Their force was vast, yes, but cobbled together from many cultures with conflicting tactics and languages. Their ships were heavier, less manoeuvrable, and most importantly, Xerxes was overconfident. Themistocles would use that. He sent a false message to the Persians, claiming the Greeks were fracturing, that they planned to flee, and that now, right now, was the moment to strike. It worked. The Persian navy surged into the narrow straits of Salamis, hoping to bottle the Greeks up and destroy them piecemeal. But the straits were tight, treacherously so. Only a few ships could fight abreast. Coordination became chaos. The very size of the Persian force worked against them, like a bear trying to chase a fox down a rabbit hole. At that moment, just before the battle was truly joined, imagine standing on a Greek trireme. The oars slide in the water with rhythmic groans. The air is thick with pine pitch and oil. The sun glints off the sea in dazzling streaks. Men murmur to the gods, Athena, Poseidon, Zeus. One man retches over the side. Another checks the edge of his xiphos, a leaf-bladed short sword designed for close quarters, its blade notched from previous skirmishes. The helmsman glances to the side, nerves etched into his face. Then a horn, sharp, shattering, and the oars dig deep. The trireme surges forward, slicing through the waves like a javelin. Others follow, dozens, hundreds. The sea churns with fury. The battle begins not with a single clash, but a crescendo. Ships collide. Wood splinters. Men scream. Greek captains shout commands, their voices raw and urgent. Back oars! Pivot starboard! Ram! Ram now! Bronze-tipped prows slam into Persian hulls, punching holes beneath the waterline. Water floods in. Men leap into the sea, some in armour, too heavy to survive. Others scramble for ropes, for planks, for anything that floats. The Persians respond, but their formations are tangled. Their size becomes a prison. One Phoenician trireme crashes into an Egyptian galley. Confusion reigns. Arrows whistle through the air. Spears jab over railings. Boarding parties clash with brutal simplicity. Swords hacking, shields splintering, blood staining the decks. On one Greek ship, a young oarsman, barely more than a boy, abandons his bench as the call goes up. Boarding! He grabs a javelin, heart hammering in his chest, and scrambles onto the deck. He sees a Persian marine climbing over the railing, eyes wide, mouth curled in a snarl. The boy lunges, misses. The Persian swings a curved kopis, a brutal forward-curved and single-edged sword designed to hack and chop. Sparks fly as the blade scrapes the boy's bronze helmet. Somewhere in the melee, an Athenian officer shouts, "Push them back! For the city!" The boy does. He lunges with his javelin, stabs, finds flesh and pushes deep. The Persian shrieks and falls. The boy stares, frozen, until a fellow Greek hauls him back behind the shield wall. And all across the straits, scenes like this unfold. Heroism, terror, carnage. Themistocles watches from a command ship, eyes scanning the chaos. He knows the stakes, knows that if the fleet breaks, if the Persians gain control of the sea, there will be no more Athens, no more free Greek cities, just submission or extinction. But he also sees it working. The Persians are faltering, their front lines are shattered. Their galleys, too bulky for the straits, are turning prey instead of predator. Greek triremes dart like wolves among them, striking, retreating, flanking. And on the cliff above, seated in splendor on a golden throne, Xerxes watches it all. Imagine that. A king of kings, draped in robes of silk and gold, surrounded by scribes, bodyguards, eunuchs and nobles, watching his navy drown in blood and splinters. He does not speak. He clenches the arms of his throne, his jaw tight as Phoenician ships burn and Ionian crews desert mid-battle. Aides murmur excuses, generals shift uneasily, but the truth is plain. He has been outwitted, outmatched not by size or wealth, but by cunning, by the will of men who refuse to kneel. As night falls, the straits of Salamis are choked with debris. Broken ships drift aimlessly, corpses bob in the shallows, and the cries of the wounded carry faintly on the evening breeze. The Greeks, battered but victorious, do not celebrate wildly. They are too tired, too aware of how close it came. But in their eyes there is steel now, a fire rekindled. They had not just survived, they had struck back, and in doing so changed the tide of history. The night after the Battle of Salamis was not quiet. Even in victory the sea moaned. Broken hulls floated like the bones of sea beasts. Oil from shattered lanterns shimmered on the surface, glowing faintly in the starlight. Somewhere, a trireme's hull let out a long groaning sigh before slipping beneath the water for good, its oars rising like fingers before vanishing into the dark. On the beaches of Salamis, Greek crews sat in clusters, tending wounds and counting the living. Some stared blankly, faces streaked with salt and ash. Others spoke in hushed, stunned tones, reliving close calls, naming the dead, repeating the moment the tide turned. A few still clutched weapons they had not yet thought to release. But no one slept soundly. Themistocles didn't sleep at all. He moved among the men like a restless shadow, checking the wounded, meeting with captains, listening for any sign of dissent or despair. This wasn't the end. Not yet. Xerxes might have lost a battle, but he still held the land, still had the numbers. And Themistocles knew that nothing was more dangerous than a wounded empire with a bruised ego. The morning light brought little comfort. Smoke still curled lazily from burning wrecks. The straits, once filled with deadly purpose, now felt eerily still. And yet a change was in the air. The Greeks could feel it. Something had shifted. They had not just survived an impossible assault, they had shattered the illusion of Persian invincibility. Xerxes, however, did not feel defeated. Not outwardly. He returned to his throne, surrounded by an entourage too terrified to speak plainly. Scribes hastily scratched out casualty estimates, most of them lies. Generals made excuses. Blame was passed like a hot coal, but Xerxes was no fool. He had seen the truth from his cliffside seat, the way his ships choked in the straits, the way discipline collapsed, the way his subjects from Ionia quietly turned on him, letting Greek triremes slip past or even defecting mid-fight. He had tasted humiliation, publicly. And for a man who styled himself the King of Kings, that kind of humiliation was corrosive. Even so, his armies remained enormous. And on land, the Greek situation was still precarious. Athens was in ruins. Much of central Greece lay under Persian control, and while Salamis had halted the Persian navy, it had not destroyed it. Xerxes still had options. But fear crept into his strategy now. He began to doubt, and doubt in warfare is a seed that grows fast. Back in the Greek camp, the aftermath became planning. A new war council gathered, Spartans, Corinthians, Athenians, men who had once viewed each other with suspicion, now forced into something approaching unity. They debated their next move. Some argued for caution. Others demanded a swift counterattack. Themistocles, ever the strategist, pushed for consolidation. He wanted to press the psychological advantage, to make Xerxes think the Greek fleet was larger than it was, more confident, more dangerous. He even sent messages to the Ionians in the Persian fleet, urging them to rise up or desert. Divide and weaken. Classic strategy, but used with razor precision. Meanwhile, across the Persian ranks, cracks widened. The Ionian Greeks in Persian service, those compelled to fight their own kin, began to question their loyalties. Some had watched their countrymen fight with savage brilliance and felt shame. Others had simply seen which way the wind was blowing. One Ionian captain, according to later tales, deliberately slowed his ship during patrols. He avoided engagements, spoke in whispers at night with his officers, a man torn between duty and heritage, waiting perhaps for the right moment to defect. Xerxes suspected treachery. He stationed loyal troops among his Greek allies. But suspicion is a brittle sword. Every time a ship returned late, every time a report was confused or garbled, it fed the fire. And then came the question that would define the next move. Would Xerxes attack again? His advisors were split. Some, like the brutal general Mardonius, urged him to stay, to finish the job, to crush the Greeks on land where Persian strength could be brought to bear in full. Others urged caution. The supply lines were long, the fleet crippled. Winter was coming, and revolts in Babylon and Egypt simmered in the background. Eventually, Xerxes made his decision. He would return to Persia. Not out of weakness, he told his court, but strategic wisdom. He left Mardonius behind with a massive land army to hold northern Greece and try to finish the conquest in spring. But the king himself would go home. Some say he wept as he boarded the royal barge. Not out of grief, but rage. As the Persian navy began to withdraw, the Greeks saw the movement and hesitated. Was it a ruse? A trap? But no, ships burned in their own harbours. Cargo was hastily abandoned. The sea lanes began to clear. Salamis had worked. Themistocles had outmanoeuvred the greatest empire on earth, not just in battle but in mind. He had forced the god-king to flinch. Still, the Greeks knew better than to celebrate too soon. On land, Mardonius prepared his winter quarters. He sent envoys to Athens, offering favourable terms if they would defect and join the Persian cause. The Athenians refused, again. Even though their city lay in ruins, even though the cost of resistance was staggering, they chose defiance. One Athenian elder is said to have answered the offer with a single sentence. "We are free men. We will not trade liberty for comfort." And yet morale was fragile. Hoplites returned to find their homes burned, families displaced, temples desecrated. Victory at sea did not fill empty granaries or rebuild walls. But it did something perhaps more important. It proved the Persian tide could be turned back. Even Sparta, haughty and proud, had to admit that Themistocles, an Athenian, had won them the reprieve they needed. That sea power mattered. That unity, however reluctant, could save Greece. And what of the men? The rowers, the marines, the archers? Most melted back into their cities, names unrecorded, their deeds sung only in fragments. But they had borne the burden of history. Their hands had blistered on oars. Their ears had rung with the clash of bronze on bronze. They had tasted fear and still held the line. One veteran, years later, told his son, "It wasn't glory, it was noise and terror and the smell of death. But we stood, we didn't run. That was enough." Even now, thousands of years on, the details of Salamis remain debated. How many ships fought? How many died? What were the exact positions, the formations, the wind? But the essence is clear. In a narrow stretch of water, a free people stood against a tidal wave of empire, and they held. The winter that followed was tense. Armies positioned, spies sent, messages flown across mountain passes. Mardonius prepared to strike again. The Greeks steeled themselves for another fight, this time on land. But Salamis had given them time, a breathing space, a psychological edge. It had also given them hope. For centuries, Greeks had fought each other, city against city, pride against pride. But now they had a common enemy, a common story. And stories are powerful things. They shape nations. They outlive kings. The story of Salamis, of wooden ships and bronze rams, of courage in the face of annihilation, would ripple through history, like the waves that lapped against the burned and battered triremes. It would become legend, and legends endure. The spring of 479 BC came not with renewal, but with reckoning. Mardonius, Persia's iron-fisted general, still held a vast army in Greece. And with Xerxes now back in Asia, the weight of vengeance rested entirely on his shoulders. He had not come to occupy. He had come to finish what his king had started. Where Xerxes had been proud and theatrical, Mardonius was cold and methodical. A warrior by training, a strategist by instinct, and above all, a man with something to prove. The humiliation at Salamis could not stand. Persia had bled too much gold, too many men, too much pride. Victory on land would redeem all. And so he marched. The city of Athens once again fell into Persian hands, its citizens having fled a second time, refusing to bend the knee. And again Mardonius offered terms, lavish ones, protection, autonomy, even restoration of temples. But the Athenians knew better. They saw through it. They knew what would follow: Persian governors, foreign tribute, and the slow death of liberty. They rejected the offer, flatly. And this time, Sparta agreed to act. That, in itself, was a miracle. The Greek city-states, eternally fractious, deeply jealous, had never been comfortable allies. But something had changed since Salamis. A subtle thread of shared identity, forged not in words but in fire and sea spray. They were not one people, but they had one cause. In July, the largest Greek army ever assembled marched north. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians, Plataeans, Tegeans, city after city sent hoplites. Seasoned warriors, bronze-armoured and grim-faced, knowing full well that this battle might be their last. They met the Persians near the town of Plataea, a stretch of open country at the foot of Mount Cithaeron, bordered by streams and dry riverbeds. Fertile land, now fated to become a killing ground. The Greek force was around 40,000 strong, with perhaps 10,000 hoplites at its core. The Persian force was larger, though not impossibly so, somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000. But they held the cavalry advantage. Archers, light infantry, flexible, fast, and often deadly. But they did not have Greek armour. They did not have Greek discipline, and they did not have the bitter, bone-deep resolve of men fighting for their homeland. For days, the two sides stared each other down. Skirmishes flared, supplies ran thin. The Greeks refused to descend into the plains, knowing full well that Persian cavalry would shred them. Mardonius grew impatient. He ordered attacks, raids, disruption. Eventually, through a mixture of confusion and command breakdown, the Greek lines shifted. Fragments of the army fell back during the night to find water and resupply. Mardonius believed they were retreating. He struck. At dawn, the Persian forces surged forward, chariots rattling, arrows flying, infantry columns charging through dust and chaos. But they had misread the movement. The Greeks had not fled. They had reformed. The Spartan phalanx, unshaken and deadly, stood firm. And then it advanced. Imagine it. 10,000 men trained since childhood to become living weapons, shields locked, bronze helmets glinting in the rising sun, spear points aimed forward like the quills of a giant beast. They moved with a terrifying, predatory rhythm, not fast, but unstoppable. A wall of muscle and metal and confidence and battlefield authority, and a thirst for victory. The Persian infantry met them and shattered like glass. Their wicker shields crumpled beneath the weight of the Spartan charge. Spears punched through fabric and flesh. Persian arrows, usually so deadly, bounced off bronze cuirasses or lodged harmlessly in the thick Hoplan shields. Mardonius himself, commanding from horseback, in dazzling armour, tried to rally his men. It was in vain. A rock, hurled by a Spartan, struck his head. He fell bleeding into the dirt. And with his fall, the Persian lines began to crumble. The battle turned swiftly. Persians fled. Some fought bravely, others simply ran, abandoning gold, banners, and wounded comrades. The Greeks pushed forward, not in chaos, but with ruthless order. It was a slaughter. Back at the Persian camp, panic spread like wildfire. The fortified palisades that were meant to be a last refuge became a trap. Greek forces stormed the gates. Fires broke out. The last Persian stronghold in Greece collapsed. Those who didn't die were hunted down or captured. Few ever made it home. And just like that, the invasion ended. On the same day, as if by providence, the Greeks launched a naval strike at Mycale in Ionia, destroying the last remnants of the Persian fleet stationed there. 2 victories, 1 message. The tide had turned. The empire of Persia, so confident, so vast, so convinced of its supremacy, had been broken. Not by another empire, but by a collection of free cities who refused to kneel. In the aftermath, the Greeks stood dazed. What had they done? They had defeated the mightiest force the world had ever seen. Not once, not in one place, but again and again, on sea, on land, in city and countryside. They had lost temples, families, friends, but they had kept their freedom. And they had sent a message, one that would echo through history like the clash of bronze on bronze. It was not just about who ruled, it was about how men should live. Should they be subjects or citizens? Should they be told what to believe or choose their own fate? The Greek victory did not end all war, nor did it end the divisions between city-states, but it changed the narrative of human civilization. It planted the seeds of democracy, individualism, and resistance to tyranny, and it made clear, empires can fall, even god-kings can bleed. Years later, when Athens rose again, its Parthenon rebuilt, its thinkers flowering, it did so with the memory of Salamis and Plataea etched into its soul. Socrates would question, Pericles would lead, Herodotus would write. The Western world, as we know it, would begin to take shape. All because, when faced with annihilation, a handful of men in wooden ships and scarred armour chose to fight back. That choice was not inevitable. It was not easy, but it was free, and in the long sweep of time, perhaps that is what matters most. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.